Okay, let's dive right into this explainer. Today we're going to trace the really dramatic 11-year chronological escalation that turned 13 deeply divided British colonies into an independent nation. We are going to look closely at a fascinating historical chain reaction. It's essentially this intense loop where every single policy change coming out of London was met with an organized, often deeply defiant response in America. And as we'll see, it's exactly this progression that eventually pushed both sides from heated political debates straight into an open, armed conflict. To help you build a really clear mental chronological guide, we've structured this into 6 distinct eras. We'll start with the catalyst of 1763, then move right through the early taxes, the military occupation, the famous tea crisis, the intolerable acts, and finally, we'll arrive right at the brink of war.
All right, Section 1, the catalyst of 1763, the aftermath of war. We're starting our journey in a year that marked the end of one massive conflict, but, quietly planted the seeds for a completely new one.
As we look at how 1763 unfolded, you can see how fast the triumph of the Treaty of Paris in February got overshadowed. Great Britain gained massive new territories, places like Canada and Florida. But almost immediately, by May, a loose alliance of Native American tribes, led by Chief Pontiac, launched these coordinated attacks on British forts in what we now call Pontiac's Rebellion. So to stop the bleeding, King George III issues the Proclamation of 1763 in October.
Now check out this absolutely staggering number, 130 million pounds. To put that into perspective for you, that is basically the modern equivalent of trillions of dollars in national debt. This was the massive financial hole Britain dug for itself to win the French and Indian War. Managing this debt literally drove their entire new strategy. The British government looks across the ocean and realizes, hey, we need to find new revenues to cover the cost of managing this giant new empire.
And that brings us back to the Proclamation of 1763, which honestly became our first major point of friction. It drew this invisible line straight down the Appalachian Mountains, essentially telling the colonists they couldn't settle the western lands they had just literally shed blood to win. The British saw it as a totally necessary measure to prevent expensive frontier wars, right? But the colonists, they saw it as an arbitrary, deeply unfair restriction on their growth.
Moving on to Section 2, Taxes and Early Resistance, the end of salutary neglect. This is where the British attempt to pay down that giant imperial debt meets some immediate, highly organized colonial pushback.
Notice how much the pace accelerates between 1764 and 1766. Parliament is actively slapping on direct taxes now, starting with the Sugar Act, followed really quickly by the Stamp Act. In response, the colonies rapidly organize a unified political reaction through the Stamp Act Congress, and surprisingly, this pressure actually works. It leads to the repeal of the Stamp Act by early 1766.
So an absolutely crucial point for those of you taking notes on this progression is that enforcing the Sugar Act in 1764 effectively killed off the long-standing policy of salutary neglect. For generations, the British government mostly just looked the other way regarding colonial trade laws and smuggling. It was kind of a you-do-you situation. But now, British customs officials and the Royal Navy were ordered to crack down and enforce the rules. The era of the colonies just managing themselves was officially over.
Let's actually zoom in on this action-reaction loop. Britain's action, imposing the Stamp Act. This was a real game-changer because it was the very first time Parliament imposed a direct tax inside the colonies just to raise revenue, taxing everything from legal documents to everyday newspapers. And the colonial reaction? 28 delegates from 9 colonies illegally convened the Stamp Act Congress in New York. They didn't just write an angry letter. They literally shut down trade by coordinating widespread boycotts of British goods.
And that energy brings us to this famous fiery defiance from Virginia's Patrick Henry. It perfectly captures the escalating passion of the time. When he introduced resolutions arguing that only colonial legislatures had the authority to tax their own citizens, he was actually accused of treason on the floor. His response here shows how fast the argument was shifting from a basic legal dispute over money to a full-blown existential debate over fundamental rights.
Section 3, Occupation and Bloodshed. Tensions boil over. So, the British repeal the Stamp Act, but they instantly pivot to new policies to reassert their dominance, leading us into a much darker era defined by military occupation and ultimately, real violence.
As we hit 1767, we reach a severe turning point. Economic disputes are now transforming into physical confrontations. After the Townshend duties are passed, resistance spikes again, which prompts Britain to send armed troops to occupy Boston in 1768. This heavy military presence directly sparks violent clashes like the Battle of Golden Hill in New York and eventually the deadly Boston Massacre.
Once again, that engine of conflict is just spinning faster. Parliament tries a different tactic with the Townshend Revenue Act, this time trying an indirect tax on imported goods like glass, paint, paper, and tea. The colonies respond exactly like before, but stronger, with aggressive, coordinated economic boycotts. Intellectuals like John Dickinson write these widely circulated letters arguing that even external taxes are completely unconstitutional if their only purpose is to raise revenue without representation.
And this military occupation had an almost inevitable, totally tragic result. On the freezing night of March 5, 1770, a local mob started throwing stones and ice at a British guard. Chaos erupts, and British troops actually fire into the crowd. 5 colonists were killed, including Crispus Attucks. The event shocked the entire continent. Now, future President John Adams did successfully defend the British captain in court, mostly to prove that the colonies still respected the rule of law, but the emotional damage, that was permanent.
Which brings us to Section 4, the tea crisis, a monopoly sparks outrage. Parliament had actually backed down and repealed most of the Townshend duties because of the economic pressure, but they stubbornly kept the tax on tea just to prove they still had the right to tax the Americans. And that stubbornness set the stage for our 4th era of escalation.
Let's jump to 1772 and watch how this builds. The colonists realize they need to be better organized, so they create the Committees of Correspondence, basically standing communication networks between the colonies. And this was incredibly fortunate timing, because just a few months later, Parliament passes the Tea Act. This was essentially a massive corporate bailout of the struggling British East India Company.
So here we see the ultimate act of colonial defiance. The Tea Act gave the East India Company a massive monopoly, allowing them to undercut local American merchants. But the colonists saw right through it. They knew it was a trick to force them to accept the tea tax. So, rather than accept this manipulative tax, in December 1773, Bostonians disguised themselves, boarded the ships, and literally dumped 342 chests of tea into the harbor. Fun fact, that is enough tea to brew roughly 18.5 million cups today. No way were they backing down.
Section 5. The Intolerable Acts. Britain drops the hammer. As you can imagine, the destruction of all that tea absolutely enraged British officials. For Parliament, this was the final straw. They abandoned all attempts at negotiation and decided it was time to strictly punish Massachusetts and make a brutal example out of them.
These crushing laws, which the British called the Coercive Acts, but the Americans quickly dubbed the Intolerable Acts, were incredibly severe. I mean, they closed the port of Boston entirely, basically starving its economy. They nullified the Massachusetts Charter, stripping away their self-government, and they expanded the Quartering Act everywhere. The whole point was to isolate Boston and break their spirit. But actually, scratch that. It did the exact opposite. It spectacularly backfired, unifying the 13 colonies even further against this massive overreach.
And that leads us to Section 6, the brink of war, militias and Congress. We have now made it to the final months of 1774. The Intolerable Acts basically proved to the rest of the colonies that if Massachusetts could be stripped of its rights so easily, literally any of them could be next. The political protests officially shift into full-on military preparations. By late 1774, you can clearly see this unavoidable march toward conflict. In September, British troops seize colonial gunpowder, which sparks mass panic. That exact same month, the First Continental Congress meets in Philadelphia to coordinate a unified continent-wide resistance. By October, King George III officially bans the export of weapons to the colonies. The writing is on the wall. Both sides are actively stockpiling resources and bracing for impact. Notice how rapidly things just completely fall apart in these steps. When General Gage seized a small colonial arsenal outside Boston during the powder alarm, his goal was to prevent violence. Instead, that one action triggered thousands of armed colonists to march toward the city. Local leaders responded by passing the Suffolk Resolves, openly urging citizens to prep for a fight. By late October, Massachusetts had officially reorganized its militia, giving birth to the famous Minutemen.
The true turning point of this whole era happens right here. The First Continental Congress brings together 55 delegates who endorse those militant Suffolk Resolves. Even more importantly, they set up the Continental Association to enforce a total, massive trade boycott against Britain. What you're seeing here is literally the birth of an independent American government. They are acting entirely without the Crown's consent to enforce a continent-wide resistance, and they are grounding it not just in English law, but in universal natural law.
So, after charting this remarkable 11-year loop of action and reaction, from the proclamation of 1763 all the way to the total breakdown of British authority in late 1774, I want to leave you with this question to really think about as you study. With the militias heavily armed, the colonies completely united by Congress, and British policy paralyzed, had the point of no return already been crossed by the end of 1774? Think about how a basic disagreement over paying war debts completely transformed into a fundamental armed debate over human liberty. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer, and keep questioning the history.